go ahead and call. Good. Let's call this meeting to order. Welcome. How's everyone?
Okay.
Yeah, well, good. Yeah, it's good to see you. Okay. Anyone care to read the Planning Commission's acknowledgement? Okay, please.
We'd like to acknowledge we are on the traditional land of a rich and diverse group of Native peoples who have called this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the descendants of these Native peoples who are still here today.
Any questions about the agenda before we approve it? Or recommendations or requests?
I've got one.
Okay.
And this relates to our first item, which is approving of minutes, which I'll offer a slight correction there, but I would like to understand, and this is really from the city, this isn't about the Planning Commission as much, how the city responds to comments from federally recognized tribes and how the city invites tribes to engage on things like critical area updates. So we may not get to that today, but I'm going to want to maybe mention that or speak to that under new business tonight.
Okay, well, we'll definitely place it under new business. If we can get to it, we will.
Thank you.
We discussed it last time, and I think it is an important subject. So with the amendment of adding the we'll just call it the tribe conversation as requested by Yanni, is there a motion to accept the agenda as stated?
Yes.
One second. All in agreement? Agreed. Okay.
Aye.
All right, thank you. All right, so approval of meeting minutes. So we have, hey Marty. So we're reviewing the February meeting notes the second time. Anybody have any recommendations or changes for those, or can we go ahead and accept them as that? Okay. Everyone in agreement?
I've got one.
Okay.
So, and sorry, I'm kind of juggling my screen here and things, but where I mentioned the part about tribes, what I recall saying was wanting to understand how the city responds to tribes. It wasn't like, I think it was framed a little differently, like what should we do about it? I am actually asking, how does the city respond specifically to federally recognized tribes when they comment? So once I find my materials here, I just got home. I'm happy to send some text that corrects that quote. Other than that, I have no other comments on the minutes.
Okay, so you're talking about the April notes or meeting notes then, correct?
I think those are April, or did I say that in February? I thought it was April.
It was April. So
yeah, thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah, let's go ahead and accept the notes or the meeting notes for February. Everyone in agreement? I think we were all pretty much there. Okay, that's good. Okay, then the April notes, then meeting notes. Let's find where that's located. Number. Yanni, give us a hint where that was located. If you can.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to get there. I'm catching up from just getting home from work. I'll find it. Just give me one moment.
Comments.
It was definitely under critical areas discussed.
Yes.
I don't know that there's a sentence in there in the
so.
draft yet. But if your suggestion is to form and add one.
Well, okay, maybe, or gosh, maybe it was April. I mean, maybe it was February, because I was reviewing these today and I saw it. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not actually what I said.
That's evil.
Yeah. We skipped March.
No, I don't think we discussed it in February. Yeah, it was definitely April.
It was in April, and it's near the end of the minutes. It's the Yamaguchi RUENOA.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
yes, correct. But I believe I phrased my comment at the time as how does the city kind of proceed when they get comments from tribes on something like this? It wasn't really a what should the planning commission do? It was wanting to understand what the city does. So again, apologize, I'm not totally organized for tonight's meeting with what's been going on, but if you would like a sentence, I will send it during our meeting. I just need to find where that is right now.
Well, I'm personally comfortable by stating the question that you just how you just stated it in the minutes, if that's
Great. Great. Works for me.
okay. Is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
Okay. So with that change, with that amendment to the notes, do I hear a motion to accept the April meeting notes? So moved.
Second. What's the change?
Oh, adding Yanni's question, how does the city proceed when receiving comments from the tribe regarding critical did you want to clarify that, Yanni, like regarding
I just any comments from tribes, but the context was related to developments that impact critical areas. That was the context. That's the context that I raised it in. I just want to understand that because that's something I deal with in my day job.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay. So public hearings, there are no public hearings at this point. Public comments. We do have a guest on line with us. Maddie, did you want to just say hi or say something? Try that. Whoop.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know you could hear me. No, thank you. Just was tuning in and listening to how progress is going in middle housing.
Good.
Thanks.
Right. You're welcome. Okay, report from City Council Liaison. Please, Mr. Rosenau.
Oh, again. Yeah, so last night we had a really interesting joint meeting with the Shoreline and Kenmore City Councils and at Shoreline City Hall, and just sort of all compared notes on what we're working on and what we're seeing coming down both legislatively and on the public works front. You will hear tiny voices in the background. At least one of my children is making strange noises, so apologies. It might also be my 11-year-old. It's hard to say. But so that's what's going on here. But yeah, I mean, the Shoreline, they're moving ahead with their roundabouts. They're almost done. We're any day now going to be moving on to ours when the culvert work is done. So, and it was just really good to see everyone from almost all of the council members from all three cities and get all of that exchange and get a sense of what we're all working on together. And it's a lot of the same issues, including on the planning commission levels. I know Ken Moore's planning commission is working on neighborhood retail questions that I know on the city council we've been thinking about. So they may wind up borrowing resources from them as that conversation advances. And certainly all of us are thinking about a lot of the same housing issues from related angles, although not always the same goal. And I think there was a shared sense that it would be nice if the legislature would give us a little bit of time to catch our breath and get caught up on some of the mandates that have come down, and let us find our level for some of the other things that we'd all like to see moving forward. I can't remember now if this had happened already last time we were all together, but our police chief has announced that he's retiring, a well-deserved break from many years of service to the city. He's come up from at least sergeant. I think he came in as a sergeant, but has been for 12 or so, 15 years with the police department and has just really done a tremendous amount to shape the culture. And so it's going to be, it sounds like the plan is to do a national search for his replacement. Commander Zanella, who I'm sure many of you know, has been asked to serve as the interim chief and is I think expected to put his resume in as part of that search as well. So anything could come out of that, but obviously big changes coming in one way or another. Even if we do hire internally, big changes coming on that front. But I think the goal will certainly be to maintain a continuity in the culture and the values that have driven the PD for so many years. And certainly, obviously, all of you, if you have thoughts or comments that you want to pass along to the administration as they try to initiate that search, I'm happy to pass along, or you can probably find folks to pass it along as well. There was a good report on the sort of the state of the police department also just before Commander Zanella's announcement that he was going to be taking the interim reins. So you can find that whole presentation through the website. It's interesting to just understand all the factors that are driving what the police department is doing and how what they're doing to keep us safe and keep things working. And we also had a presentation that same night on the new public works director's work on a traffic safety plan. So this is the first of two parts. Not tomorrow. What day is today? Tuesday. Thursday, we're going to hear from her again about the traffic improvement plan, which is the other half of that process of trying to shape our streets. The first is really data driven. Where are we seeing crashes? Where are we seeing safety problems that we can document? And then where are we looking? The second part of it is what can we do to get ahead of those so that they don't happen in the first place? So both of those are going to be pretty exciting and good opportunities for public feedback on where we need those changes and how we can make our streets walkable and safe and build community in those public spaces. Yeah, Yanni.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm kind of going off camera, so you don't have to watch me chew my food. So I hope you appreciate that. I wanted to ask Councilmember Rosenau if you could just say a few things about this email that went around to residents about city services being down to 4 days a week and kind of what that, what's the discussion that led to that? And, you know, we get asked, I think, right, I know I do, as commissioner, hey, what's the story here? So Can you help fill that in, please? Thank you.
I have not had my check-in with city staff. I'm doing that tomorrow. So I think I'll get a lot more information then from the Administrator Hill. But my understanding is that it's not the plan right now. It's not like we're going to a 32-hour work week, at least imminently. Although there are things to be said for that in general, but I think everyone's overworked enough that I'm not sure that they would have 8 hours a week to give up. So the plan is really just sort of closing the public-facing parts of it. And Director Hoffman can correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, but I think that it really is just sort of the public-facing parts. The work will still be going on behind the scenes. There's as a lot of the planning department, other parts of it have gone more online. There's less urgent need for the help desk, and so it's a chance to sort of consolidate that and harvest some savings out of that. Not have people in the office, not have the building open and have to do all of that end of it. That's my understanding, but does
this include the passport office?
The passport office is going to stay open on, I believe, the same hours. That's my recollection.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to, Mark, if you know more, I'm happy to defer to you if I said anything wrong, because I certainly don't want to.
Yeah, and I'm not privy to the purpose or the discussion or the decision, but I can say all departments, there is no impact on service levels or what we do or hours or FTEs or our expectations for performance. It's simply that it's public facing closing on Friday. And those that don't have work from home remote agreements with a secure, quiet home office can come to City Hall, but they can't bring public in or do anything of that sort. So it's a cost savings, but no performance related impacts.
Yeah, that had been my understanding. I'm glad I haven't said anything wrong to anyone else around town. But yeah, I think that those are the big things that we've been working on. And as I mentioned last time, we are well into budget season now and trying to figure out how that's all going to play out. So if you have thoughts on things that we need to be thinking about for that process for the next 2 years, now's the time to raise your voice. We're shaping the next biennial budget right now, and that'll be a process that runs through November probably.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question?
A couple of questions. So Josh, about the Fridays being the non-public day for the city government, how does that amount to savings if the city hall is still going to be open for some of the employees to still come and work there? Is it just like the reception areas and some of the areas around like the tickets and all of that is going to get consolidated, or is it just like also time savings for people?
I like Director Hoffman said, there's not going to be, it's not changing. As far as I know, it's not changing anyone's hours. I'm not sure about the front desk staff, but as far as I know, it's not changing their hours either. So I think that it is more a matter of that there's things that you have to do to have the building operating and open, and we can sort of, and there's just safety concerns and all the rest of it, that when the doors are unlocked and people are moving through, that things can be a little bit scaled back when it's not open to the public. But like I said, I'm going to get more into the details on that tomorrow when I get my update with the city administrator.
So some cost savings analysis and so forth, we weren't privy to that. But for CD, for example, it's assumed everyone right now comes to City Hall, and this would change that. For my department, it has no effect. 2 of our positions are 0.75 and 0.8 and don't work on Fridays anyway. And then the half of them that are remote that have never come in on a Friday. And so the change for us is the one person and me that's been covering the department in person on Fridays can still come in, but probably not use it might be a joke, it might be serious. Don't use the air conditioning or the heater. Right? But we're not going to lock you out, because the alternative is to stay remote but not be in an environment where you can be productive. It's not preferred, but it has very little effect and no effect on my department. Or no physical change, really.
And Josh, my other question is about the you said the meeting between Shoreline and Kenmore cities and neighborhood retail for Kenmore. Just curious, what is like the plan that Kenmore has underway about neighborhood retail, if they have any, what the discussions were?
Their planning commission is working on it now. So I think they've got a video up on city social media. They've got a survey out for the public, sort of getting input on exactly how they scope that and how they adapt the broad concept to the city of Kenmore's needs. I can find that and pass it around to you all just for your general amusement.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. So moving forward then to old business. Go area ordinance update. So do you want to use?
Yes, this is the first time both directions. David Greetham, our temporary senior planner who does projects, is joining us tonight.
Hey everybody.
He's working with us in a variety of projects, Lakefront Park, a lot of the shoreline permitting, RUEs and so forth. He has a very extensive background in permit reviews, local government. He's lucky enough to be retired, but we have allowed him out of retirement to work part-time for the city on projects. He's well versed at summarizing and getting at the highlights or main points or purpose of critical areas. So he did for a living. So, and I tend to get lost and get sidetracked and die in the minutia. And David has that skill. So tonight we've asked him to kind of give an overview. At the last meeting, we provided a background materials, one of which was chapter 1616. So it's not an easy read, and you will not absorb it. So what we do have a tendency is to read it over and over as we apply it to new projects, and then we learn the nuances. As we go into amending this critical area ordinance, it gets highly technical, and we will hire that technical skill to assist. But we wanted to start off with understanding what it is and where it's at before we start amending, and before we coordinate with tribes and start crafting and considering amendments. So we have all year, but we thought tonight we'd spend the first 40 minutes or so with a presentation, allow for some questions, and kick it off that way.
So before we do that, I think, Mark, you mentioned last time at our meeting is that there are some kind of parameters that we hold back for questions until the end. I think you were saying that it's best to kind of listen intently as.
Now, this is where David comes in. He's really skilled at bringing it back to the primary point, where I get lost on the question and then forget where we were.
Okay.
So that's why I'm not doing it.
So is it okay to ask questions as David goes along, or David, what do you think?
I'm certainly fine with it.
Okay.
And because I'm only working on one monitor here, maybe Mark or anybody can feel free to speak up if I'm not seeing either hearing anybody or raised hand. Feel free to just get my attention. All right. Assuming you guys can see my screen here. Mark, thanks for the intro. I started my career way back when in King County in the Environmental Review Division and wrapped up my career working with Director Hoffman at Bainbridge Island. So yeah, there's a lot of critical area review and even a few critical area updates in between. So we're going to shoot for a high-level overview, and the good news is nobody has to memorize anything. I tried to put a fair amount of links in the PowerPoint that Mark shared with you earlier, and that we'll go through here, just so you have access to information, because there's so much technical information that's been developed over the years for critical area updates and best available science. We'll talk about that in a minute. So let's jump in and go through. Yeah, we'll talk about what critical areas are protected. We'll go over a little bit about mapping, what map resources we use, that high-level code overview we talked about, and then I'll wrap up with pointing you to a couple of code update resources and some interesting stuff there we'll chat about then. Okay, so let's dive in. This is a lot of words on this page, but it is important because it lays out from the Growth Management Act the 5 key critical areas: wetlands, areas with a critical recharging effect on aquifers used for potable water. We often call that CARAs, or critical area critical aquifer recharge areas for short. So if you hear CARA, that's what the second bullet is. Third, frequently flooded areas. Fourth, geologically hazardous areas, and you'll see when we get to that slide there are a few subsets in that one. And then fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. There's also a couple subsets in that one, streams and then habitat areas. So we'll walk through those. This paragraph, I pulled this straight from the Department of Commerce Growth Management Services, which is where the state's key resources are for critical area updates. The reason I pulled this wording in is because it calls out the emphasis on salmonids and anadromous fish, those that start in freshwater, then return to freshwater for the end of their life cycle. And that's actually called out in the state law. So that's what this paragraph is essentially saying. We're protecting these critical areas, but give a special emphasis to special consideration is the wording, to conservation and protection measures necessary to preserve or enhance anadromous fisheries. So that's a special call out. It just something to keep in the back of our minds as we get into any updates. Okay, we're going to jump into a few of the map resources. We don't necessarily need to go to all the links here, but you can play with these. This is certainly not an end-all and be-all for mapping resources for critical areas, but the first 4 on this list I included because they're directly referenced in the current critical areas code, Title 16, or excuse me, Chapter 16. The first four are directly referenced as resources to be relied on for mapping. We have our city. I'll show you an example of a couple of these in a minute, but Department of Fish and Wildlife has priority habitat and species maps. The Lake Forest Park Water District has critical aquifer recharge area mapping. The Stewardship Foundation has a wonderful report called The Life of a Salmon, I believe is the name of it, and it has information and mapping on our streams in the city. And then also FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, because we're required to also, as we just saw on our list, uh, review flood hazards. And those are limited in the city, but we'll talk about those in a minute. So FEMA, if you play with this link later, it'll take you to the FEMA's mapping center, and you can enter any address, even the city of Lake Forest Park, and it'll pop up and show you all the different panels with flood zones on the FEMA website. So that's what we rely on to determine where our flood zones are. Again, they're very limited in the city. And then King County has some great mapping resources. I'll show you an example of what's called the King County IMAP in a second here, but there's also a watershed tool map that's got additional layers that King County has been working on. I'm not even going to try that link because for some reason I believe they're updating it because it's real slow right now. But feel free to play with all these links later. And this isn't everything. I mean, you can actually go to the State Department of Natural Resources and find geologic mapping. There are all sorts of maps, but these are our key four plus a couple extras we rely on. Okay, here's just a snapshot of what the city's map. This is focused in area just across where City Hall is at the intersection there and across the street toward the lake. The blue shading indicates stream buffer, that's Lion Creek. Green indicates potential wetlands. And I say potential because these maps, we learn early in this business that these maps are never the end all and be all. They're a starting point, but they do not substitute for a site-specific delineation or observation or review. They're just a tool to tell us what might be there. I mentioned floodplains a few minutes ago. You can see the darker blues here, here, and here are mapped floodplain. There's only a couple other blips of floodplain in the city. One of them was up at the new fish enhancement culvert on Ballinger Way, 104. That's nearing completion, I believe. That had a little bit of a mapped floodplain on the upland side of it because of the barrier created by the old constrained culvert. But there are just a couple tiny blips, blue blips like this scattered across the city. But the main floodplain is this area to the west of the Lion Creek Preserve, which is in this area right here. It kind of goes down this area. And it typically means it's a low-lying area that could flood if, for example, a stream overflowed or a wetland or a lake level was raised high enough. Obviously, Lake Washington is fairly controlled. So pretty limited floodplain. We'll get to that in a minute, though, as we go through the different critical areas. Here's an example of King County's IMAP. You can see it's a different look, but you can go to that page, and these are all click and zoom. This is just a medium zoom view, but you can clearly see the green corridors from McClear and Lion Creek here, and then the side tributary streams. And there are all sorts of layers that you can select here. But this is a great map. We rely not only on the city's map I showed you, but the King County maps are very, very helpful too and fun to play with. So feel free to explore those links further. There's both the King County IMAP and I mentioned a watershed tool map that's really helpful. That's a newer map as well. Let's start to walk through. Oh, here's the quick codes for the main chapters. These aren't, I tried to make the link take you to the most relevant development standard to start with, but you'll be able to scroll up and down when you go to those parts of the code to see the surrounding information. For example, geologic hazardous areas has these four subsets: erosion hazards, landslide hazards, seismic hazards, steep slope hazards. So this will get you to the main buffer requirement, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you can scroll up and down from there when you go to code. Wetlands is in this section. Fish and wildlife habitat. CARAs, critical aquifer recharge areas, and frequently flooded areas. So those are just links if you want to play with those and go to the code. I'm not intending to have anybody read code tonight. You'd probably be sleeping by the end of the meeting or halfway through. So we won't do that tonight. But those links will get you there. So why don't we start with why don't we go through the 5 key areas in the code that we listed under the state statute at the beginning of this presentation. Geologically hazardous areas. I'm going in the order that they're in our code, so it's a little bit out of order of the state list, but it's the same topics. And just for fun, I threw in a reference from even a source that Google has where you can see what's called LiDAR mapping. Some of you might know that term, others may not. But it's really a method of mapping that sort of strips the vegetation away so you can actually see the shapes of the slopes in the steep areas. Like the darker it is, that means it's a steeper slope there. There's some very relatively flat areas here, a little more slope there. There's a stream ravine. So LiDAR is a really cool way to sort of see what the landscape looks like. That's another map resource that DNR has, Department of Natural Resources has. Um, all sorts of map resources out there. So let's get into what the key elements of the geologically hazardous area section is. I mentioned the 4 types. We mostly at the staff level deal with landslide and steep slope hazards. Erosion hazards are really more about, those are soils that are highly erosive. So that's more about managing drainage. And we do have drainage review. We use the King County Stormwater Manual. So that isn't about setbacks. That's more about just making sure you're managing your stormwater. Seismic is more about earthquake hazards, and it's typically not applied to single-family residences. However, there are special engineering requirements for commercial projects, critical facilities, things like that, depending on the the seismic zone we're in, and that's really played out through the building official review of building permits. So we spend most of our time in the planning department on landslide and steep slope hazards. And again, back up here, you can see where some of those are going to pop out in the ravines. There's a lot more it's not showing up here. Here's a pretty steep ravine up off the Ways. You're coming out of Seattle into the city. You can see the sharpness of that ravine right there. But there are all sorts of slopes throughout the city. You can see some moderate slopes here. And if we were to expand out, we'd see, as you know, as residents of the city, you know there are slopes all over the city. And so the key buffer for slopes is 50 feet of vegetation from the top and the toe, and a 15-foot construction setback. That 15-foot construction setback is typical for most of the buffers I'll mention. And that's so you have that elbow room. Say you're putting a foundation and you don't want to put your foundation right at the 50 feet or you're cutting into the 50 feet with your equipment. So there's almost uniformly an additional 15-foot building setback from any of the buffers in the code we talk about tonight. So that's just something to have in the back pocket. The code has a built-in buffer reduction on that slope buffer down to 25 feet or about a 50% if the director is satisfied that a special study, a geotechnical study, has justified that reduction. So we occasionally get those requests, but our director is very, very good about asking the applicant to always show the full slope buffer first before you even go there with the reduction request, so we know what the standard buffer would be. Then we will, if the request comes up, we'll review that geotech report to see if that flexibility is appropriate for the site. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but it depends heavily on what the geotechnical engineer or geologist recommends for the site. So as with all the buffers we'll talk about, there's a little bit of built-in flexibility. If we go beyond those, then we have something called a reasonable use exception, which you've heard of, I'm sure, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Any questions on geohazards before we jump down to wetlands? Okay.
I'm not standing here.
Okay, thank you. Wetlands. The figure I included in this particular slide is important because that is the end all and be all manual for all the wetland consultants that do wetland delineation studies, which is when a project comes in that's either includes a wetland or is adjacent to a wetland, they need to hire a wetland biologist to delineate the wetland and then go through the whole rating system, where you determine what the habitat value is and assign points. You determine what the receiving water body is, what watershed are you in, all these things. It's really, really complex. That's all contained in this manual, and this is all at the Department of Ecology's webpage. There's, as with everything I talked about tonight, there are great state resource agency web pages. And so I pulled this right off the Department of Ecology webpage. But this is the manual we rely on. It's 2014, and all the consultants have to use the same manual. And this is what determines the ultimate rating for each wetland, which is going to be one of 4 categories. We'll jump down to that. Wetlands go from 1 to 4. 1 is the highest, 4 is the lowest. 1 and 4 are the outliers. One is going to be the very rare bogs or super high value habitats that are really impossible to replace. You really need to avoid impacts in those altogether. Very high functioning wetlands. Lowest, I guess the classic example of a category 4 is a heavily disturbed pasture that was a wetland but was drained for pasture use, but still has enough what's called hydric or wet type soil to be a wetland. Those tend to be the lowest function. Those are category 4s. Almost everything we review, or we get in the door, is a 2 or a 3. It's high to moderate level. And again, it's not assumed you can replace these things because the starting assumption is that you actually meet the code, but these do present some opportunities for mitigation if impacts cannot be avoided. Very hard to mitigate for category 1 and really, really need to avoid impacts entirely to ones. But so the buffer widths they range significantly. The lowest value can be 40 to 50 feet for 4s. They can be 225 to 300 for these higher level ones. And it really depends on what that habitat score is and what the rating forms come up with in the manual. So this link, if you want to play with it later, will take you to this manual. And you can sort of get a glimpse at the pages and pages of rating forms that the wet consultant has to fill out to come up with the ultimate category, which is over here. We also rely on ecology as sort of our mom and dad or parent for wetland, all things wetlands, because they are the recognized state agency that provides guidance. We have actually a regional assigned wetland planner from ecology that we can rely on, which is great. And so we very much appreciate that there's a great amount of resources that ecology provides for local jurisdictions. I wanted to point out the mitigation sequencing requirement. I mentioned a minute ago, the starting assumption is that you meet the code, you meet the buffer, and again, there's always a 15-foot building setback from the buffer as well. So mitigation sequencing, if you're on a constrained lot, you start by avoiding altogether. This is a short version of it, but you avoid, minimize, and if you can't avoid impacts entirely, compensate or mitigate for them. And there's a table in the code that actually tells you which of these categories, for which of these categories you're impacting, what the ratio is for mitigation and replacement. So, for example, if you have to fill part of a category 3 wetland for an access driveway because there's no alternative, you might have to enhance a wetland at, I'm just going to throw some numbers out, 6-to-1 ratio, or replace at a 4-to-1 ratio, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole table. These are all in tables in this chapter, in the wetland chapter in the code. So there's a lot of variability in buffers. It's not just 4 set buffers. It's a range for each one, and it's largely based on the habitat score. Any questions on wetlands before we go on to the next thing?
Just curious, it says that it's a 2014 update. I wonder whether there's a cadence for updating and whatnot. Is it in process right now, or do these usually last for 20 years, or what's the kind of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't heard about a current update, but this is the most recent, and I just haven't heard anything from ecology recently, unless I'm out of the loop on it, about the next update. And I didn't see anything jump out on the page when I visited it. That doesn't mean it's not in the works somewhere, but that is what jurisdictions are currently using. But we usually also have a blurb in the code that says "or as amended." That way, you don't have to update the code every time this manual is updated. So it's really valuable to add "or as updated" in the code when the code is updated.
I'm sorry, Dave. For the purpose of our critical area update, there are changes that affect wetlands, but they're in RCW or WAC state legislation, not necessarily just in this manual.
Is that where most of the changes are coming from? Is that state mandated or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you could always exceed them or do local flavor, but the amendments that we're going to do this on are entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder that our driver requirement is to use best available science when we update our codes. And that's where these resources I've linked you to are so helpful now, where we didn't really have that as much in the old days. In the early days of GMA in the early 90s, Those weren't the first critical areas ordinances. When I started at King County way back in the late 80s, they already had what was called a sensitive areas ordinance, and I'm sure they'd probably had it for some time when I started. But eventually the term critical areas ordinance came into play with the GMA, the Growth Management Act. And in the last 30 plus years, 35 years, the state has really amped up the resources available for, and we'll show you that link to the page at the end here, available for jurisdictions updating. And there's a lot of guidance. There's guidance for small cities for critical areas ordinance updates. There's wetland guidance. There's stream guidance. A lot of great info out there that just didn't used to be there 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, shall we march on to our next category? We've talked about geologically hazardous areas. We've talked about wetlands. Now we're going to go to fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. This is broken into two primary groups in the code. First one is streams. But I should mention this document. I just talked about all the resources that are available. This is from Department of Fish and Wildlife. And in 2020, they created this manual, this volume 2, which has management recommendations for establishing stream buffers in your jurisdiction, depending on what type of area you're in. They have Eastern Washington, Western Washington, dry, modest, wet forest, all sorts of options. But again, another relatively new resource that's just fantastic when it comes to looking at buffer options. I wish I could say that was a picture of Lion Creek, but of course that looks like Eastern Washington to me, maybe Central Washington. But it's a great document as a resource for when the time comes. So let's jump into the requirements for streams, and they're similar to wetlands. There are 4 types of streams. Wetlands are called categories. Streams are types. Just keeps on our toes. S is a shoreline stream, and these are really regulated by the Shoreline Master Program, so we don't really have to worry about these in the CAO, but they're still called out by the state, so we'll mention them here. Streams that are classified as shorelines have 20 cubic feet per second or more, so it's usually the largest of the of local streams, the larger ones. So maybe right near the mouth of the lake, we get into some type S streams. But most of our streams in the city are type F for fish bearing or type N for non-fish bearing. The code further breaks it down into non-fish perennial, so basically year-round versus seasonal. That's not really a very important distinction anymore. It might be for the health department when they're reviewing septic drain fields, if those even happen in the city anymore, because seasonal versus year-round water is important for determining state septic rules. But as far as we're concerned, we have the same buffer, 50 feet, for all non-fish streams, non-fish perennial or year-round and non-fish seasonal, all have a 50-foot buffer. For fish streams, and this also applies to type S streams, so again, it's the same buffer for our larger fish-bearing streams, it's 115 feet. Like everything else we've talked about, there's always a 15-foot construction setback from that buffer edge. So the range is 50 feet to 115 feet, and like most of the other buffers we've talked about in the code, there's a built-in 25% buffer flexibility. It's not a get out of jail free card. It does require a critical area study to support the request reduction, the reason for it, and whether the habitat impact can be offset in other ways. For example, the code talks about buffer averaging. It's like the toothpaste tube where you squeeze in one area and squeeze out somewhere else. So the first thing we'd look at if somebody asked us with a development proposal, can I reduce the buffer by 25%? One of the first things we look at, okay, is there an area where you can push out by 25% on the other side or connect to a forested habitat by expanding that area by 25? So push-pull kind of thing. Anything beyond the 25%, like we talked about lands, gets into a reasonable use exception, which again, we'll cover in a minute. Are there any questions on before we go on to the next topic? Oh, the reason I threw in this wordy definition, it's just a good reminder that not everything you see is a stream. This is the state definition, and we use it too. If it's human made or for stormwater, it's not a stream, although there is this little catch about unless they're used by salmon. So that can be a tricky thing because salmon do a left or right turn sometimes and go into a human made water course. But in most cases, streams are naturally occurring, and the easiest way to tell them, and when you're in the field doing a field visit, whether the water's present or not, is there a defined channel or bed? That's the telltale sign. If you see a low area on the site, that doesn't mean it's a stream. It has to have a defined channel or bed. And there are also state guidance rules on, okay, if it's got defined channel bed, how do you know if it's a fish stream if you don't see fish? Well, that's based on the gradient. If it's, I'm going by memory now, if it's less than 16% gradient and there are no man-made blockages, it's wider than 2 feet, it's presumed to be fish bearing. So when people tell us, well, I've never seen a fish in that, we still presume it's a fish bearing stream if it meets those minimum size requirements and gradient requirements. And then non-fish perennial and seasonal, again, presumed did not have fish and therefore a 50-foot buffer.
David, Council Liaison Rosenau has a question.
Oh, okay, yeah, hi.
Yeah, hi. I just maybe you said this and I missed it, but that 25% buffer, is that's sort of ministerial? It's just in the planning process, this conversation can happen and it doesn't require.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, most critical areas codes, including the cities, have I'm going to say a roughly 25% built-in administrative flexibility, but they also have rules attached to each of those flexibilities. So in the case of streams, you have to submit a critical area report justifying the request. The director has to review that or his designee and determine if we concur it meets the intent of the critical areas code. When you're below that is when you get into something that might require public notice, like a reasonable use exception, which again we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, and the 25%, that's city code, or is that based on state law?
That's city code. It's common, but I shouldn't claim everybody has it. I think every critical areas code at jurisdictions I've worked at have had something like that. It's like the built-in safety valve to recognize that a lot of the lands were divided well in advance of the creation of the critical areas codes. So there are a lot of lots that can't or don't comply. But it is not mandated by state law at all. Matter of fact, the city could choose to have a straight buffer, and anything below that could require a reasonable use exception. That's a local decision. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I mean, I assume that there is some upper limit as well on what it would be, but
Oh yeah, yeah, and I mentioned this document here because this is a great resource to this Riparian Ecosystems Volume 2. It really lays out what happens in the stream channel and what's both the area of influence outside that inner buffer, and really helps give some direction on, depending on tree height, what's an appropriate buffer. You can really get down in the weeds as far as varying buffers. Most jurisdictions try to keep to a relatively few choices, but some, I believe, have gone to something called site potential tree height, which Department of Fish and Wildlife likes because it tries to recognize what the potential tree height is in that particular area of your jurisdiction and base the buffer on that tree height because the trees have such an influence on what happens in that riparian buffer, that stream buffer. So there is that option. It's more complex, and presumably some jurisdictions have gone that route. I can't name any, but I know there has been a push for that.
thanks. Yeah, I'm only asking this as we think about whatever updates we're making, what the room is for change and what's constrained by state law or just good practice and obviously staff time.
Yeah. And the short answer is really that there's a fair amount of flexibility in local decisions on buffer widths. We talked about wetlands a few minutes ago in the 4 categories. There isn't local flexibility in the categories because we all need to have the same manual to determine what the categories are. But once the category 1, 2, 3, or 4 is determined, the local jurisdiction has flexibility to assign the range of buffers. It should be based on best available science, and that can be debated, and it often is. But so there are some bookends on it, the best available science bookend, but there's a lot of flexibility within those bookends. Okay. Well,
One question.
yeah, go ahead.
David, one other question about the stream. So under this definition where it can't be like man-made, we have a lot of kind of streams and creeks in Lake Forest Park that over the years have been culverted or kind of put underground through man-made things, but they were originally kind of, and I think the Stewardship Foundation has this in their map of that you referenced of kind of the salmon habitats. And
Lake Forest Park, would those still be considered streams if they had been culverted and put underground or in a man-made structure if they started originally as naturally occurring?
Yeah, and that's based on my experience with asking some of the questions to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which just like ecology is sort of mom and dad when it comes to wetlands, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is our state lead on stream habitat. And even man-made blockages like culverts that block fish do not change the status from fish to non-fish because it's a human-induced blockage. It's not a natural blockage. If there's a waterfall, a natural waterfall, that might take something out of the stream category or the fish category because it's naturally occurring. But a human blockage like a culvert and the things you're talking about can also be restored. So those are still presumed to be fish-bearing and streams if they were originally.
Thank you.
You bet. So the next subset under fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas is the habitat areas. So this covers things outside. I threw the definition over here. Also include non-aquatic areas that serve a critical role in sustaining needed habitats. So this is priority habitats that the state maintains a list of. And an interesting one that we see in Lake Forest Park is the little brown bat that pops up if you click on the state's priority habitat maps. And this is areas where endangered, threatened, and sensitive species have a primary association. And we rely heavily on state maps for this. And if something is clearly occurring in an area that we think that appears to create an alteration that would significantly impact then it triggers a habitat study, and the consultant is required to go through the state materials, look at habitat recommendations. Another example I could think of is the great blue heron. I think that last I checked, that was a state sensitive species, so it's not the highest protected, but there are priority habitat recommendations for protecting heron rookeries. It can be things like that. There could be in the 90s, it was often bald eagles that were the focus of these non-stream habitat areas. And the recovery efforts actually worked pretty well because of the state guidance on habitat protection. So at the end of the day, this is really about those other areas that are outside of our streams. That's sort of the other subcategory of this section of the code. Again, great resources and the State Department of Fish and Wildlife priority habitat maps and recommendations. We rely heavily on that for when we encounter these areas. Any questions before we go on to our next topic? Okay. Critical aquifer recharge areas, or CARAs for short. And again, this has got a really long title in the state list because it mentions potable water, but critical aquifer recharge areas for short. This is reliant on, especially called out in the code on this technical report that the Water District did in 2017. And I linked it in that section, so feel free to play with it later. But if you go through that, it's a highly technical report, and it's really based on, let me say first, this typically doesn't impact single-family residential development, but anything beyond that, because that's an assumed allowance in critical aquifer recharge areas because it's assumed that single-family homes are not a primary pollutant to aquifers. No doubt there may be some pollutants, especially if people are dumping things in the ground, but it's really focused on commercial projects, other facilities that are above and beyond single-family homes. So you don't run into this with single-family home development, but with larger projects, we would if they fall within one of these mapped areas. But back to this report studied the travel time to public wells, public water supply wells. I think they're Group A wells, and created these zones depending on the soils and how quickly the water travels to the soil. So that's really how these maps are created. It's what wells are highly susceptible to pollution based on the travel time from something that enters the surface of the ground to get to those wells, and it's based on a 10-year travel time. So I'll jump to that here. And there's that definition. Designated critical aquifer recharges are those areas within the 10-year travel time of travel, zones for Group A public water supply wells. And that's what that report is about. So feel free to play with that link later. Again, this doesn't apply to single-family homes, but and as a matter of fact, it even says in the code, development in critical recharges shall be limited to those uses allowed under single-family residential zoning. And again, that's typically because, in my experience, Single-family residential zones or homes have not been identified as a primary aquifer pollutant. But commercial projects that have chemicals, any larger project is going to be reviewed in depth against those maps. And may be prohibited, but they typically require a hydrogeological study assessment to determine, yeah, are they really in that zone where they could impact the well due to travel time, and should the use activity be prohibited, which they may be. Any questions on this section before we jump to our fifth topic, final topic? Okay. Our final one of the 5 key areas is frequently flooded areas. Sorry, that's a little bit of blurry map, but that's again across the street where Lion Creek comes out. This shows some potential flood area associated with Lion Creek. Again, we don't have much map flood zone, frequently flooded area in the city. Unlike some of the rural valleys in the county, which we hear about every rainy season, we don't really have that in the city. So it's not something we encounter very often, but it is, there are some key terms, and what it does, the code redirects us to 1620, which is our flood damage prevention code. So even though it's got to be in your critical areas code, we redirect to a standalone flood damage prevention code, which is 1620. And I think nobody has to memorize this, but the key terms that are most commonly encountered when you're doing flood review is there needs to be a floodplain administrator in each jurisdiction, and that our code says it's the building inspector. Typically, I think that would be the building official. Probably Mark in the case where the building official is currently being hired. Mark, are you currently the flood administrator? I think you probably are, aren't you?
Acting.
Acting. There we go. Right. And
Yes.
then the term base flood elevation is the maps I mentioned earlier when we showed the links up thread here. FEMA has base flood elevation maps, and those maps establish what the elevation is that you need to have your lowest floor be at or above. And typical to other codes, we require the lowest floor be 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And there is an opportunity, not to complicate things, but if we meet FEMA standards, then they will provide flood insurance for citizens in the jurisdiction. And they actually do, through Department of Ecology, what are called community assistance visits randomly, and those are surprises because they're really audits. But you need to be able to show that if they pull permits, we need to be able to show we are ensuring that the lowest floor is at least 1 foot above, and that if it's, say, a garage, that lower level has to have vents where water could go in and out. All sorts of things are in this flood damage prevention code, but the bottom line is the elevation you build your building at, and we need to be able to show our work. Doesn't come up very often in the city. There are also standards for utilities in flood zones and how you would elevate a utility box in a flood area to make sure that the electrical portions are safe. There are requirements for non-residential structures. Subdivisions have to show that they're not planning to be focused inside the flood area. And then critical facilities like hospitals. It's key to review that, the flood element. So again, this doesn't come up very often, but it is something we're required to do if we want to maintain good standing with FEMA for flood insurance. And I've been in a few jurisdictions where FEMA will, again, they contract to the State Department of Ecology to do this work, but they will randomly come to your permit counter and say, pull these 10 permits and prove that you did your flood review as per your code. And so it can be, unless you have your flood review in order, it can be a little bit of a surprise when they show up at the front door for the community assistance visit. I don't know that they would actually do that to a jurisdiction of our size, but we should always be ready for that just in case. And maybe Mark has more experience in this, and maybe we're not subject to that review, but counties certainly are.
Because of our topography.
Yeah.
My experience, I was the CFM in Snoqualmie because there was just massive amounts of 100-year and 500-year floodplain. And flood insurance rate reduction if you do go beyond the NFIP standard. So it really mattered annually reporting stop and visits. Here, as you look at the flood insurance rate maps, there's 3 or 4 little blips and the city will go from there. So we'll be the last on the list.
Yep. Of all the things we've talked about tonight, this is the thing we least often encounter in our review. Very, very rare in our review.
Yeah, friends in Carnation, Duval, Snoqualmie, that this is them.
Yep. Okay. If there are no questions about that, I was going to try to. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
I think it was just a cough.
Pardon, I didn't hear that.
Oh, I think that was just a cough.
No
Oh, okay.
question.
Sorry about that. Okay, we'll jump to our wrap up. I was going to try to finish this up around 8, so you leave some time for questions. Just the permit types. We have a major critical area permit, a minor critical area permit. The key difference is this is heavy equipment. This is typically handheld equipment, maybe removing invasive species, something like that. We have reasonable use exceptions. We'll talk about that in 1 second. And then we have a list of exemptions that do not require permits, emergency actions, most operation and maintenance activities that are already in a critical area but that were established before the code can continue, like landscape maintenance activities if your yard happens to be, which many are, within a 115-foot stream buffer because the yard was developed, say, in 1963 or 4, well before the code. That is recognized and allowed to continue. Passive recreation, which is typically going to be trails with limited access points to the critical area, does not require permit. And there are certain allowances for whoops, sorry, went too far, for invasive species removal. There we go. That don't require that permit. So most of the time you see a notice, it's going to be a major critical area permit. That means somebody's doing some sort of impact in the critical area of the buffer, and it requires heavy equipment to do, therefore it triggers that major critical area permit. One more thing I wanted to cover here, reasonable use exceptions. We've probably all heard about these. These apply to very constrained lots. The assumed starting point is that you meet the code, but here's the quote from the code, the intent of this policy, which is to provide a mechanism that protects critical areas and approves the bare minimum amount of use, I think that's key language, and disturbance when strict application of this chapter would deny all reasonably economic use of a property. The code actually provides some guidance. Some of you may have been involved in that previously for footprint size. It's not mandated, but it's certainly guidance that an applicant has to consider. There's also something called, I don't think I've used the exact term, but there's a flexibility for the front zoning setback that the director can apply if it takes some of the pressure off a critical area, the classic rock and the hard place, somebody's between the front zoning setback requirement and the stream in the back. Well, the code gives the director an option to be flexible in the front setback first before pushing into the buffer on the critical area in the back. So that's built into the code for some flexibility as well. There's also a similar section called public agency and utility exceptions. It's almost exactly the same process as this, but it's, for example, a public utility that needs to go through critical areas or public agency project, but they both require public hearing. So in each case, those reasonable use exceptions or public agency utility exceptions require a public hearing process and the notice that goes with those. Any questions on RUEs before we move to the end here?
Yeah.
Oh,
So I'm really curious about this and about whether we need to focus specifically on RUEs in our update, because right now we have 2 of these sort of going on in different phases in the city, and both I'm just scratching my head at what the heck is going on here. One of them, which is the Gary RUE up on kind of 205th and 35th or whatever it is up there. That one is odd. It was a little bit surprising. I had submitted formal comments, yet I wasn't notified about the hearing, but I heard about the hearing. And according to folks who did attend, the hearing examiner did not appear to have read the comments submitted. So I thought I provided rather compelling comments pointing out that the previous owner of the property had already exercised the right for economic use by selling an easement to someone that basically eliminated the buildable part of the lot. And now we have a new owner trying to bully the city into letting him build a house on top of the stream. So I'm pretty leery about this because and I'm curious for your perspective, David. Is this about tightening our guidelines that we use, or is this about is this a miss or a problem by the hearing examiner? What are we dealing with? This one should not even be alive anymore. This should be dead in the, in a ditch. And apparently, this landowner is, I mean, it sounds very speculative. They bought this specifically to tee up a fight like this, and they hope to win because we're a small city and we don't have a lot of money to fight them. So that's case one. The other one is this Yamaguchi one where they've proposed things that are completely outside of the guidance that we've provided around footprint, yet they appear to be charging ahead. So I'm just curious, since really both of you have worked in many jurisdictions, how's Lake Forest Park code on RUE compared to others? Because it feels like the code reads okay, but it's being treated like garbage.
Well, staff absolutely disagrees with that. The code is pretty clear. It's a plain English version. It's in the code. We're implementing it. We can't talk about individual cases. That's still an active pending application. There's due process rights there. It was at the hearing at the start before public comment, the applicant revised his design in the first hour of the hearing, and it was remanded, and it's still active, and we can't discuss it.
That's Gary.
And yes, so for this video, we are not actively discussing the active application for Gary.
Understood.
My experience with the RUE is it's a flexibility because otherwise it's a taking, and the city will buy the lot. We're not buying this lot, and the code is pretty clear. We're implementing the code that's in place, and it's pretty standard code. I can't speak to the past as to what the perceptions were or what past staff members valued or knew. But you're talking to two people that have done this for over 30 years. So
I appreciate that. And like I said, Mark, the code reads well to me, but I'm not clear on how this is being, like, are there weaknesses just in the system, not in our code, but in the system that allow kind of these frivolous actions to go forward? Again, I'm not asking you to speak to Gary. I understand you cannot speak to that at this time. Are there things we should do as we update our code, and the planning commission's where it starts, to tighten? Are there things other jurisdictions do that make it, just tighten the standards up so that we don't end up in these situations? Or is this just business? This is just how it works.
But I can only give my opinion. Most cities are more permissive. They draw a radius of a quarter mile or 800 feet. They examine the house size and the market values and say that's the average. So there's your minimum development right for a single family. This city goes further and has adopted guidelines. I have to say that the word guideline was inserted very carefully with the advice of the attorney. And while it's in the code, it certainly doesn't rise to the level of a mandatory standard. Most cities do not have those guidelines in any shape or form. So in that context, our code already goes beyond most jurisdictions, definitely all the jurisdictions I work in this region.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that explanation. And again, I was not criticizing staff or the code because I thought it looked good. I'm just trying to understand what's actually happening, which seems contrary. So thank you for that. Appreciate it.
And I'll just add the hearing examiner is an independent, acts as a judge, right? And has been doing this a long time. He's hired by the city to be a fact finder and to make those judgments. He's well aware of the code, but maintains his independence. Staff's role is to form a recommendation, do a staff report, and frame the facts correctly. And that's the extent of what we do. And so that may not have been as strong as it could be in the past, but I would offer it's very strong now. But in the end, the hearing examiner is the decision maker.
And let me just ask, this is just a process question. Is a hearing examiner required to read the comments submitted?
So I'm wondering if we could have set this conversation aside, because I think there are some questions around the RUE process.
Yeah.
And I think the community has questions about that as well. I think that would merit a conversation, but I'd like to come back to what David is presenting. Not to avoid that conversation, but I just want to keep us on track. Honor David's
No, that's fine. I just took advantage of the fact that we have two experts in the room, and I wanted to hit them up and maybe see how they both see it. But I hear that. Thank you, David.
Sure.
And just on a process side point, feel free to email me directly and we'll make sure your comments are in the packet. We bundled a whole bunch of older comments together. So I want to make sure we didn't miss any, and just feel free to email me and we'll take care of that procedural item.
Yeah.
For when we go back.
And to answer it in the greater context of what we're doing with this effort, every comment is packaged in our recommendation and staff report and is hearing material. That entire record is given to the hearing examiner.
So I do have a question, David. We're working on middle housing here in Lake Forest Park, right? And I'm wondering if you're seeing any cases amongst other jurisdictions where the critical areas is being threatened by middle housing initiatives in different jurisdictions.
I'm not aware of any, and I'll defer to Director Hoffman too, but in my observations with recent legislation over the last 5 years, what's really been, we won't call it a collision course, but SEPA requirements have been relaxed for some of the housing initiatives, but not critical areas requirements. So that's been my observation. So the critical area codes are still applicable, but the SEPA procedural requirements are being somewhat relaxed for affordable housing projects. I'm not commenting pro or con on that, just saying that's what I've observed. Okay. Yeah.
And then for small jurisdictions, ours is a tier 3 experience. So it's much smaller. It can't compare to Shoreline Seattle.
Yeah.
But we went into 2024 and 2025 expressly that whatever we were going to adopt it from the middle housing mandates had no negative impact on trees and critical areas. So
yeah, I was just curious though. Another jurisdiction.
Yeah, so I've kind of waited to ask this general question, but it seems like the appropriate time to chime in with that because we had talked about kind of drawing on the wisdom of our neighboring cities, Shoreline, Kenmore, Montlake Terrace, Bothell. But critical areas are obviously important in terms of not only development, but impact to the residents of the city. So I'd like to get a sense of how do we compare as a city proportionately in terms of land that's in critical areas to those other neighboring cities? Do we have more critical area scope or less, or is it about the same?
So I think that question can be answered by the reports that were provided by the consultants, right?
Sort of. David touched on it. All the mapping and guidance and so forth is a guide. It's citywide. So what we can say is that based on size, topography, and in comparison to other cities and the size we're at, we have more per acre than most. Right? We're intense with critical areas. But we cannot tell that from all the information we have because it's site-specific analysis that will get you those numbers. And that is given to us when there's a project proposal. And so the cumulative is not known.
Right, but I would suggest that we keep that in mind when we're making, these kinds of analyses and comparisons.
The polar opposite of that would be you would do a critical area report for every square feet of the city. And it would quickly age and it wouldn't really matter. And so as development is proposed, they bear that full burden to analyze not just the property, but the critical area is adjacent properties. So generally 200, 300 feet, and the effect that would have on that greater critical area. And so all the quantities we get are based on just essentially that area.
Right. Well, I mean, I myself experience the impacts because, I live at the bottom of the hill. And when, a development causes erosion and runoff increases, it affects my property. So.
If there are no more questions on the actual topics, this is really my last key slide. And this, I mentioned earlier, there's a great resource at the Department of Commerce Growth Management Services for critical areas updates. If you get time to play with this link later, it's interesting because there's even, and I haven't talked to Mark about this, so I'm not suggesting it, but you'll find all sorts of resources, including the option for cities of under 25,000 to actually adopt through interlocal agreement the county level critical areas code and have each county's best available science update suffice for the city's effort through an interlocal agreement. That's an option on there. That's as of 2023. That's a new thing. There's guidance for small cities updates on here. It's really a neat site. So if you are interested and want to play with the links I've included in the PowerPoint, please do. If there are no more questions, I've really enjoyed talking to you guys. There's our emails, you know Mark's, and there's me. But I'm going to stop sharing here, but I'm certainly open for any more questions. I don't want to take too much of your time tonight, but open for more questions.
I see one more hand up.
We do have one more question. Oh, Councilmember Josh?
Yeah, hi. I just sort of the, I don't know what it would be, the contrapositive or something of the question before about how critical areas have been affected by middle housing. I'm curious whether we've seen in the city critical area preventing a permit for anything that might have come in seeking middle housing approval yet, or is the current state of the code having any effect on implementation?
Mark, I'll defer to you on that. I haven't seen anything, Mark, but I'll defer to you on that answer.
Without diving into the weeds, let's say we have 4 examples in critical areas that are not their biggest issue. It's timing that they need to do unit lot subdivision or condo and explain that at the same time as the building permit. But these are, what am I thinking of? What's a detached duplex?
Yeah.
No, it's that next category, cottages. So critical areas are really not negatively impacting them. It's on the easier end. They do have issues, but it's in regards to utility services and unit lot. And then, and I'd just be guessing from there. We have analyzed that we do have some larger lots. Street frontage was talked about and the potential of what it would change. Most sites that middle housing could be built on will be affected by critical areas. And in essence, would be able to do accessory dwelling units, cottage duplex with the same structure that David just went through. The same buffers, the same setbacks, and then determine whatever's left. And that would determine the extent of the middle housing that could happen.
Right. Thank you.
David is on mute.
Yeah, David, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, guys. Thanks for the conversation. I'm going to stick around with my video off and listen in on your housing discussion, but I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I think it was enlightening. It was very clear.
Yeah.
I
Thank
learned a
you.
lot. Okay. That's great. Thank you for coming, David.
And before we move on, I realize time is an issue. For the next agenda and beyond, if we could sneak that conversation about tribal communications and so forth in, we're kind of at that point of, as we learn what's already in place and then explore the checklist and the potential amendments, we're leaving the intro behind. So any input and timing on next steps will be helpful.
So what are you asking?
Don't be afraid to start talking about next steps and what you would like to see.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Because it's a lot of self-learning, self-absorption. We could help, we could assist, clarify questions, but as a commission, we're kind of moving into what is the overall effort. Ecology's checklists, tribal communications, like Yanni brings up, collaboration, coordination, resources that we need to bring in. Kind of move in that direction this summer.
So do we want to have that conversation now, or do we want to put down on the agenda for the next planning commission meeting?
I think we have enough time to discuss what's on the agenda, and maybe we can move this to the next
Okay.
month.
Everyone in agreement?
Yeah.
Okay.
Seems reasonable.
Okay, so that you want large items. All right, and the next old business item is the affordable housing draft purpose statement objectives. So Marty, Sam, and I, as promised, we did get together to discuss what could be the potential purpose of the affordable housing initiative that we're forward with. So do you mind?
I just realized that I haven't learned that skill.
Oh no, okay. We have a few slides.
They were distributed, so you have them all on your laptop. The danger of me showing them here on Zoom is I'm actually creating a record as I'm doing it, and I'm definitely by far not a pro of how to open it, share it, and not disturb the record.
Okay, well, we can speak to the one side. Yeah, I'll give you a few seconds to do that if you get yours up. Okay.
Yeah.
Sam's got his up. Marty, are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay, Yanni, are you okay with you?
Yeah, I've got them.
Okay, okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. So Marty and Sam, please feel free to join in the conversation. Okay. So the goal of this conversation really is to reach consensus amongst us, determine what is the purpose or the guiding purpose of affordable middle housing in Lake Forest Park. They're determining what that is. And some guiding questions that I have here are, what do we believe is the Planning Commission's role in supporting affordable middle housing in Lake Forest Park, which we've started that conversation. What outcomes do we hope our work will produce for current and future residents? What does affordable housing mean as related to Lake Forest Park's values, constraints, and identity? And how will we know we have fulfilled our purpose?
I discovered the way. I'm hooked in through the city Zoom account. Yanni, if you have that on your laptop, I can make you a co-host. You could share your screen if you have the slides up.
Yeah, I should be able to do that.
These are great questions.
Thank you. There's a good conversation that Marty and Sam and I had, and based on some of the conversation, the email that you sent to us, and conversations that we've all had together, Yanni, your input. So this is hopefully we'll get to a point where we can say, hey, this is how we're going to move forward with affordable housing. So on the
Can you guys
slide,
see that now?
yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna leave it in this view because I only have one screen and I'm gonna get confused. So I'm just gonna leave it like this instead of presentation mode, if that's all right.
That's fine with me.
Thank you.
Hey, Johnny, if you could go ahead and move to the next slide.
Good.
So proposed purpose. So we want to remove unnecessary obstacles to middle housing development while conserving Lake Forest Park's community character and livability. Can we all agree with that? That's our purpose.
I think that's really good.
Yes.
I agree.
Okay, Yanni, you okay with that as being our purpose?
I mean, I'm fine with it for now. I have some comments on kind of the overall approach, and I really appreciate you three putting this together. I do have a few comments, but let's kind of go through what you want to present, and I do want to ask a few questions about the purpose also. But no, I really appreciate you guys stepping up to do this.
Okay. So under this purpose, we want to identify and evaluate code provisions that inhibit middle housing development. We want to resolve any ambiguity and clarify unclear standards. We want to recommend clear, objective, and measurable standards that remove uncertainty for applicants, staff, and the public. And we want to ensure that all code revisions are evaluated against and meet the established criteria. So the criteria that we'll talk about next was really based on the conversation that Sam, you and John had. And I don't know if anyone else was part of that conversation at first.
It was just some emails, John.
Just some, okay. And then we discussed those criteria again when the three of us met. So the proposed criteria would be that we ground all of our recommendations in available verifiable data that would advance our purpose. We ensure all proposals uphold Lake Forest Park's environmental and climate commitments, such as tree canopy protection, critical area ordinances, although that seems like that's not too much in jeopardy anyway, but that we are respecting that, stormwater standards and related policies. We want to avoid unintended consequences. And so, what is an unintended consequence? So these are some examples of unintended consequences. It's higher density at the expense of Lake Forest Park's quality of life, environmental degradation, like causing a hotter microclimate in one particular area of Lake Forest Park, site-specific development pressure on constrained parcels, equity distortions, loss of neighborhood character and livability. Should I just keep walking through the slides and then we'll have a discussion?
Can I ask a question about just one thing? I'm a little unclear on the equity distortions description. Can you just speak to that?
So in some experiences in some jurisdictions, by building middle housing, it actually increases for instance, it just increases the unaffordability of certain areas, making it even more difficult for people of different economic backgrounds to be able to afford those to afford housing in those areas, as an example.
Okay, so let's say there's proliferation of middle housing. It drives up the property taxes of surrounding parcels because they're deemed developable with more than what's on there. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and then just like
Okay.
the equity distortions, that's already in that jurisdiction.
Okay. It was just a new term for framing that, so I just wanted to make sure I understood what you meant. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. And so we also want to maintain a clear scope of work by focusing on recommendations within the Planning Commission's responsibilities. And I think, Sam, you read what the Planning Commission's responsibilities were at the last meeting.
Yeah, I had that kind of quote pulled up, but I don't have it in front of me. It was just from the code. I can pull it up as we're going ahead.
Okay, so on to the next slide, just to note on unintended consequences. Actually, I'm going to skip this because we can come back to this. So the next slide are proposed options. So we have proposed 3 options, and that we're hoping that we come to some consensus on which option we want to pursue as a planning commission. Option number 1, given that the comprehensive plan has been updated to reflect middle housing requirements, this proposal suggests that we focus on removing unnecessary barriers to middle housing development in city code and explore offering pre-designed plans. So it's pretty much just looking at the code, what code does not support the middle housing as we've stated, as meeting the Department of Commerce requirements. Is that how you would describe Sam? Anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, option 1 is just we look for barriers in the code, we remove those, and then we explore operating pre-designed plans that meet the code.
So that's just like the basic work. Yeah. Okay. Then option 2 is that we focus on number 1, still as that basic code, and we incentivize the building of middle housing within the current code parameters. So we address small a, and we do not incentivize one over the other.
Can you say what you mean by one over the other? Do you mean small a over big A, or do you mean different types of middle housing?
I think different types of middle housing. So we wouldn't say duplex over, detached ADU or cottage housing. So, and I think that was from the council member that we heard at what the Councilmember Rosenau had said that was the direction from the council. They didn't want us trying to prioritize one type of middle housing over another.
Or at least I get that. I was just trying to make sure I understood the bullet for what it's saying. So we might, for the benefit of the public, just say not incentivize one type of middle housing over another. Because this is that statement's a little bit,
Okay,
I mean, I was confused and I'm part of this work, so that'd be
sure.
great.
Yeah, I have the same question where we are talking about, like, it really says address small a, but also not incentivize, because when I initially was reading, I was like, we want to address small a, because when I think about the first option, and when we talk about pre-designed plans, if it's small a, it's easy to limit it and then start to say that we could have some plans ready for implementation. But if we don't want to go in that direction, then it's very contextual. It depends on the property, it depends on, like, what the requirements are going to be, and it is just going to shift. And it's very hard to say we'll have pre-designed plans when, depending on the property and the type of, like the housing, it could be many different types. So I feel like the option 1 and 2 kind of like contradicts itself too.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I know we want to kind of go through this and then maybe discuss more, but what I struggled with on option 1 is that I actually just the explore offering pre-designed plans is actually to me like a massive additional part. So if you were to strike that clause, and maybe that's a 1B, but that's actually a very, very high effort thing. So if it were instead to, update housing requirements, focus on removing barriers, to include middle housing that we've already approved in the code. That to me makes a lot of sense. To me, explore offering pre-designed plans is not a bad thing, but it is a massive other thing. So I'm just going to note that for now, that I think we might talk about, I mean, that could be a companion, that last clause could be a companion, to various of these options, but I feel like it deserves a standalone bullet to basically say we're gonna go through the effort of providing pre-approved designs for cottages, for duplexes, for courtyard apartments, and now you can choose from those. I don't know how this city would ever do that, to be honest with you. But
So I hear what you're all saying, and the optimal word there was explore. So it's not not a definite, but I like the idea of making that a 1B as a potential. John, you have that comment.
I'm a little confused about the distinction between option 1 and option 2. Because I'd just like to be a little clearer about what an unnecessary barrier is. What's an example of that? I mean, one person's unnecessary barrier be considered someone else's incentive.
Prime example is building code.
Right. So
It's mandatory, so it's not.
unnecessary barrier is a pretty big description, I think. So I would just like to understand more clearly what we're talking about.
Contradictions in code, things that might not be clear, yeah, that would give builders pause or.
So again, what is that contradiction? So it's hard for me to picture this without, maybe it's just a grammatical error or something, or, if it's clearly just, on the line of typo or something, that's one thing, but
It's not, but Sam.
Yeah, I think we've talked in the past months about things that some commissioners have felt are maybe unexplainable or unnecessary barriers, like lot frontage requirements, minimum lot frontage requirements on the street. Is that an unnecessary barrier, or is that something that we have a purpose for having? And so I think the idea would be, we'd be grounded in our remit, which is focused on recommendations to the council about the zoning code. So we'd be looking at the zoning code and looking at, are there parts of the city that cannot be developed for middle housing that we supposedly just approved? This was Yanne's point last time here from the developer, that they don't even know where they can build it because there's so many contradictions in our code. So we need to do that exercise to find, where is there ambiguity? Where are there requirements in the code that maybe don't make sense for these criteria, which are preserving kind of the community in like Forest Park, preserving the environment, so on and so forth.
So,
And can we relax those? So that would be the table stakes on option one or an option two. We would need to agree that this is an unnecessary barrier based on the criteria, like.
so maybe the word potential needs to be inserted somewhere, because that's what got me hung up. We said we're removing unnecessary barriers.
So
But
it's their potential.
we're going to,
Okay,
evaluate whether those barriers are necessary, right?
Exactly.
and that's part of the work, yeah.
Yes.
So,
Sam, as you were saying, what you were saying kind of makes more sense to me. Like you expanded on that, where you're like, well, where does it make sense to develop this middle housing, right? I think like that, where to develop middle housing is the underscoring. It's not about like providing plants. Maybe there are like examples are out there, but it's more of like where, based on our knowledge, based on the exploration that we would do, where do we think there are places for middle housing, like within the Lake Forest jurisdiction? And I think like that's the thing that we probably explore. That's the recommendation that we give of like, we think like this street or this particular zone or this particular area is more suitable because we know that it is away from, all the critical land, or we know that this is for this reason is better suited because it's like a larger parcel, and like whatever those reasons might be, that zoning recommendation make more sense than like talking about like changing the actual code or providing any sort of plans.
I think that where is just part of the question. We can define where, we can do middle housing, but there's still code that may inhibit that middle housing being built. And then if we go down to option 3, right? It may be that we want to eventually pursue building beyond a duplex on a piece of property. So what's that going to require?
Hey, while I'm sharing screen, it's like my little raise hand function disappeared.
Yep,
so I'm like the kid in class who doesn't know how to wait. But couple of comments. One, just some caution about what was just offered, which is that, the middle housing came by way of state mandate, right? And the state mandate even, said we sort of can't just say no because of some critical areas. That doesn't mean we can't protect our critical areas. It means we can't say, well, this property has a sliver of critical area, therefore it's not eligible. That was already decided. So I'm not sure we can do the area-based kind of, we think here more than here. And Mark can probably correct me on that. I just want to be really careful about us going into that space because we just went through a long process to essentially approve the minimum that the state required on that. So let's be careful about that. I actually agree with John's comment about the removing unnecessary barriers. I think we want to identify and evaluate barriers. And it's up for us to figure out, well, those are barriers we want, right? Or there are barriers that really aren't serving a purpose. So those are the ones we want to get rid of. So maybe it's instead of removing unnecessary, it's evaluate, identify, and I would put in parentheses, with the help of people in the development community, identify barriers and evaluate those to make sure we're getting rid of ones that don't add value to the public.
Okay, so let's back up for a moment. So, let's clarify the language for option 1. Okay, mostly I agree with what you're saying, Yanni. So let's change the language. Given the comprehensive plan has been updated to reflect middle housing, blah 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 requirements, we focus on identifying and evaluating barriers to middle housing development in city code. Keep it like that.
Yeah. Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are we comfortable with that as being number 1 goal? Okay, great. So let's look at option number 2. So we focus on 1, we still want to do that work to make sure that the code reflects the ability to build middle housing in Lake Forest Park. Okay, as we've identified. So, and then we incentivize the building of middle housing within the current code parameters, address small a, and not middle housing.
Not one type of middle housing.
Not one type of middle housing over the other.
I guess the other part of the confusion I have about barriers is that, for example, as a developer, I could say, well, the permit fees are a barrier. Right.
And they are saying that.
That's an incentive, right? So, it's kind of like one person's barrier is another person's incentive, but so I'd like to know the distinction a little more clearly there, what is an incentive?
So John, that's the work that we've got to do.
Okay. Right.
Moving forward, we can't answer that question right now, especially given we're trying to create a framework for answering those questions.
Yeah.
Sam, what?
And I would just philosophically frame the difference between 1 and 2 because we've been talking about this for 7 months at this group and we can't seem to land an answer. Question is the goal just removing barriers in the code, or is the goal removing barriers and also trying to encourage the development of middle housing? That's option 2. Option 1 is just removing barriers so anybody can build middle housing where it's been permitted under the city code. So where do we want to align philosophically? Are we trying to do 1 or 2? Allow it or incentivize it?
And maybe that's the first question we just asked. Like a consensus. Can we just to vote on that? Just option 1 or option 2 as well?
Not to double back, but double back. The second clause there that we're talking about, the explorer offering redesigned plans, that does seem, like Yanni said, a slightly separate work stream. It almost feels like it fits into 2 because that could be a way to incentivize or perhaps you incentivize the building of middle housing. Not that we would actually do it, but just go and ask other cities, how have you dealt with redesigned plans and whatnot? That seems proactive in a way that option 1, a minimal plan, doesn't necessarily cover, I guess.
Okay, so let's take that off of option 1. Okay. So that's off of option 1. Option 1 is just given the comprehensive plan, so already been updated plot, etc. We focus on identifying and evaluating barriers to middle housing development. Period. Okay. So that's number 1. And then number 2 is that we focus on 1 as well. We have to do that. And then incentivize the building of middle housing within current code parameters. But what Sam is saying is that philosophically, this is what we've been discussing for many months now. Are we comfortable with just removing barriers and allowing, to ensure that middle housing the building of middle housing occurs in Lake Forest Park? Or do we want to go, number 2, go beyond that?
Sorry, I was just going to point out Councilmember Rosenau has had his hand up for a bit. And again, I can't raise my hand, so I'm sorry. But
That's
I'm
okay,
just going to point that out.
And I don't want to interrupt this conversation. This is you guys' decision, and I don't want to. I'm not weighing in on it. For my own notes, I wanted to the question that John is asking is also one that I'm wanting to make sure I understand for my own purposes. And I'm thinking about, when you get to option 3, the question of how much density to allow, for instance, if a developer were to come and say, I cannot build an affordable duplex on this property. It cost me X amount to buy. It's going to cost me X amount to develop. And to sell a duplex there, it can't be cheaper than $1 million. So there's no net gain in affordability. The only way that it pencils for me to have something that's affordable is at some higher density. Is that sort of thing a barrier, or is that an incentive? And I want to understand how you're drawing that distinction. I'm not saying this to argue one way or the other, but just I want to be sure that I'm understanding sort of the scope of what you're picturing down these different paths.
Yeah, I think option one is you remove any barriers in the code to allow middle housing of the type that we've approved anywhere in the city. Option two is you do that plus you incentivize it. Maybe you reduce fees, maybe you reduce permit fees, maybe you have pre-designed plans, maybe there's something else you do. Option three is that story. Above and beyond what the code permits, I can make it profitable, I can make it small A affordable. If I put 8 units on this lot, can I do that? That would be option 3.
And we're also saying that, you know, this could be, look, all 3 options could be looked at as an overall plan. We could get to option number 3 eventually. But we would first want to do the work of making sure that the code reflects the ability to build middle housing.
I just to comment, and again, I appreciate you guys putting this down, and now you're sitting here listening to us kind of pick it apart. And believe me, I've done that many times myself, and so I appreciate you guys doing this. I'm struggling a little bit in that same space as Councilmember Rosenau, in that the one place where I think number 1 is insufficient is specifically, and I honestly haven't thought a lot about what was the fourth one, courtyard apartments or whatever. I really haven't thought about that a lot. I've thought a lot about cottage. That there, it's like, to me, it's basically a barrier is the lack of a density incentive, because a developer, there's zero reason to ever choose cottage-sized housing if somebody could build full-size duplex. So to me, that to me doesn't feel like incentive. It's more like baseline rules for getting, that type of housing to be feasible. It doesn't mean we have to cut their permit fees and, offer those types of incentives. But I feel like if we believe the cottage housing is, well, we've said it is, we think it fits Lake Forest Park, then to me, like there, it's like, okay, we need to do some work to make that just feasible, not even incentivized, but feasible, because right now it's just not. So it's kind of somewhere in between 2 and 3, right? Like, the example that Councilmember brought up of, this duplex isn't going to pencil out. That to me is a much bigger question, because we've said duplexes are fine. Duplex has a number. It's called 2. Cottage housing, we've said cottage housing is okay, but when you kind of drill into what cottage housing means and how it's implemented, it is specifically about allowing a larger number at a smaller scale with shared open spaces and usually community parking areas and things like that, that I feel like that is kind of incumbent on us to do something in that space. And I don't even think of it as an incentive. I think about it as making it possible.
Okay, so Yanni, so looking at option 3 then, how would you, so if we remove incentivize, right? The word incentivize, and change it to promote development, that could cottage housing, it could.
Yeah.
Would you be comfortable with option, stating option 3 like that?
Yeah, I'll just say, dude, I struggle with trying to, wordsmith on a screen where a bunch of us staring at it. I'm just trying to convey to my fellow commissioners what I'm thinking. And I'd be happy to kind of think about this actual wording in this and provide some feedback. I'm just trying to convey the struggle I'm having with kind of separating them this way, specifically as it relates to cottage, because I don't think number 1 gets us there. It's like, okay, let's just get barriers out of the way of cottage housing, but you still only get 2.
So Yanni, it doesn't. That's not the purpose of option 1. Nor is it really the purpose of option 2.
So,
Okay, then
question.
I'm for 3.
So in option 2, we said we don't want to incentivize, but now we are talking about option 3, which is very much incentivizing something like cottages, which is going to be high density. Right?
If we go there, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I think the difference, so we talked about the difference between 1 and 2, and I'd see the difference as 3 a little differently. So 1 is removing barriers in the code for the types of middle housing that are allowed. Cottage housing is allowed, it's not allowed for more units than is currently allowed. So I get Yane's point that it should mean something that it doesn't mean in code, but that would be not option 1. Option 2 would be you remove the barriers, you also incentivize it through whatever levers you can to hopefully encourage when a lot is going to be developed, it's not a single family home, it's middle housing. Moving the scales towards middle housing. Option 3 would be the development incentives. So you can go above and beyond what is currently allowed on a lot, which is 3 units, 2 attached and 1 detached. This would say you can do 4 or 5 or 6 if some criteria are met or in some areas or something beyond that. So those are the differences. Option 3 philosophically is we think it's our mandate to encourage and grow the density in the city beyond what it is currently and beyond what we've permitted in the law as long as it's middle housing.
Okay, thank you. No, I appreciate hearing your thinking there.
And I would suggest that we land on one of these options or another option today. My sense is we've spent 7-8 months talking about this. We've got about 6-minute meetings left in the year. We've said this is a focus area, and if we can't get past neutral into gear on what we're trying to do, and if we just keep admiring the problem, we're not going to make any progress this year.
And we did say that at our last meeting that we would decide once and for all tonight.
Should we vote?
If we're ready for, yeah, I think that Yanni, I don't know if you can change. Can you make a change on the slide at all?
Let me see if my technical skills are adequate. It might be difficult, but
okay. So let's just do this, and I will read each goal. Okay, as I think it's written now. So, so option number 1. Given the comprehensive plan has been updated for middle housing to reflect middle housing requirements, we focus on identifying and evaluating barriers to middle housing development in city code. Okay. Option number 2, we focus on number 1 and incentivize the building of middle housing within the current code parameters, address small a, and not incentivize any type of middle housing over the other.
my only friendly amendment is there. I'm not sure that the addressing small a helps this sentence. I think it's really clear if we say middle housing within the current code parameters without incentivizing one type of middle housing over the other.
Okay. Okay. And then options 3 is that we focus on 1 and 2 and essentially go behind 1 and 2. Allow additional middle housing to increase the supply of middle housing, really to build up density of housing in Lake Forest Park.
How much time do we have to do this work? Till the end of the year? Or are we gonna have a certain time limit to say we should have these proposals?
I think that's a good question for us to ask ourselves.
This is different than the comp plan update and the middle housing mandate. Those were time sensitive with a grant. We had no choice. We were going to be subject to model ordinance. This really is at your own pace.
But the longer we take to do this work, the more difficult it is for Mark to do his job to people to incentivize middle housing if that's what we want to do.
So I don't know if Maddie's still tuned in here, but I remember one thing that she was talking about was that when you guys made the changes, that there could be some unintended consequences that needed to be cleaned up. Is that also included in option 1?
Well, so no, so there's criteria that we discussed. Okay, and so whatever changes we want to make, we want to at least look at what might be the unintended consequences
So that would be.
in each of the options.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that criteria fits for each of the options.
Sure.
Okay. So let's vote.
How do you want to do this, Chair? I mean, it's a little, sometimes this type of voting, 1, 2, 3 is a little bit odd.
Yeah,
so how do you want to do this? Do you want to have people speak to the option they want to support? And then we'll see where it goes, or do you want to just vote now?
Well, how do you feel? I'm a little bit nervous about putting it out there, but just like 3 options, but
I guess I can tell you where I go.
Let's do that. Let's do that for, okay, please go ahead.
And why? Because, I think I would go with option 1, because you gotta start someplace, and we have been in neutral for a while.
Okay.
Even while I've been here, and it would seem that, to me, there's still a little bit of ambiguity between, barriers and incentives. So I think starting with option 1 is the reasonable thing to do.
Okay. Thank you.
And I personally don't think that we have heard from the community that our goal is to increase density. Increasing affordability and diversity of housing, yes, but so.
Okay, thank you.
That's my thing.
Okay, Sam.
I'm with 1 for the same reasons.
Okay, Marty.
I'm 3 actually. I think just looking at the options, it kind of describes a work plan, stepwise, that I would be willing to commit to. So certainly I think that option 1 is starting point, but I think that option 3 is the goal. So we're talking about statement of values for the planning commission. That's where I sit.
Okay, so Marty, just to be clear, so are you voting for option 1 or you're voting for option 2, 3?
3.
Okay, thank you. So
Option 1.
option 1, okay. And Yanni?
Yeah, I'm on 3, and I think Marty said it well. I mean, I think we have to do 1 and let it sort of, work our way up. But I think without 3, I think we're kind of failing to follow through on what we said in our comp plan amendments, because we're actually not going to produce the diversity or affordability if we don't talk about density of small scale housing. So I feel like we need to get there. That doesn't mean we start there, but we need to get there. So I'm with 3.
And that was my vote for 1 was not saying I didn't want to move to 3. It was just starting with 1.
Well, I think we need to tell the public where we think we're headed. And I get it. I agree with you. We start with 1, but option 3 says we focus on 1 and 2. So we start with 1 and 2. Maybe we say start with 1 and 2, but we recognize that we need to get to talking about things like this. And density is one way. And again, it's not some abstract density, it's density of small scale housing. So it's a different, to me, that's what we should be wrestling with. Once we clear the, unnecessary, or at least, barriers that aren't adding public value, get those out of the way. We should talk about that problem. Maybe not even for all the housing types. Maybe it's just cottage, or it's cottage and courtyard. I don't know. That's for us to wrestle with.
So
I'm 3.
So I'd like to make this official for us to vote on each option. So for those who would vote for option 1, please raise your hand.
As in the positive? Oh, okay.
As the framework for moving forward at this point. Okay. Option 2, option 2, and option 3. Okay. So we're definitely moving forward with this conversation. That does not mean that we won't have the conversations around option 2 and option 3. Okay. Because I think we are in agreement that we do, that there's a way that we can. We're not, personally, Yanni, I'm not disagreeing with you. I just want to make sure that we're moving forward with some kind of framework, that we're getting, that I think taking the time to look at to identify and evaluate code will help open up
other questions. And lead us on the path to the next level. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
5 seconds to spare.
New business.
Yanni's addition, tribal
Yes.
communication.
So
let me just say 2 sentences about that. I think, sometimes we are a little too anxious to be done at 9:00. I just want to put this out there. Yes, please.
Before you do that, then, if we can contract with everyone that we can move beyond, or that it's okay to have a conversation that moves beyond 9:00. That's okay. Okay. Thank you, Yanni. Go ahead.
Thank you. Just briefly. So, as I've shared, my job nowadays is to be a tribal liaison. So I think a lot about how local government interacts with tribes in a way that meets both legal, ethical, moral kind of obligations to the people that still live here, used to live here, and we've taken over their land. We offer them land acknowledgement and so on and so forth. So my question is really, and I think this is more for city staff, but because I don't think it is the commission's responsibility to do this. It is the government, it is the city. So I'd like to understand how the city, like what principles does the city apply to engaging with tribes on things that they might care about? So for example, I've got several different parts of King County Department of Natural Resources right now that are launching code updates of one category or another. Shoreline, stormwater code update over here, solid waste master plan over here, wastewater long-term plan over here. And one of the key principles is to reach out to tribes, well before the public, and to reach out to them before we've already decided what we're going to do. In other words, reaching out to tribes when they can still inform our thinking at early phases, especially on things like code updates. So, for example, if I were advising King County and they were doing a critical areas update, they already did theirs, but if they were doing that now, I would say, well, King County, I'd say reach out to the 5 recognized tribes that we deal with. Here, I'd say probably just one, probably just Muckleshoot, maybe the others, but probably Muckleshoot. Say, hey, we are launching a critical areas ordinance update. Here are some things we think we're going to focus on. Would you like to engage? What would you like that to look like? Here's some materials. And, that's enough to start. If you send that to the right people, that's enough to start. You're conveying in a respectful manner that you want their input to inform this important process that protects the functions and values that they care about a whole lot, because we are in their treaty reserve fishing area. So that's my question, really. And I don't know, Mark, if there is an articulated policy at the city or a practice. That's, if I were your tribal advisor, I would be saying you should do that. So I'd like to understand what the city does. As I've raised with those of you who have been here for a while, I struggle with our land acknowledgement because I don't see us actually bringing tribal interest consideration into our work. We just say the acknowledgement. So to me, I really struggle with that. So that's where I'm coming from. This can be for next time. But that's kind of my request. I want to understand what the city does, and I would love to hear what other commissioners maybe think at our next meeting about what we maybe think collectively the city should do. I think it's really important. I think it's a, moral obligation, and for some governments, it's absolutely a legal obligation. And I think it matters. So that's all I want to say for tonight. So thanks for agreeing to listen to me for a couple minutes.
And from staff's perspective, it's hard to explain the different levels. So at the highest level is government to government. That's not me. I'm not the government.
Correct.
So, then when you get lower down the food chain, it's development regulations, code updates, code amendments, comp plan. And then the lowest level is project review, right? And the procedural process.
Correct.
Commenting. And I would offer that at that lowest level here at Lake Forest Park, it's going well. The Duwamish comment on practically everything that comes their way, either through SEPA, the clearinghouse, or our direct mailing. They're on our list, working well. We don't have many amendments. When we went through comp plan and middle housing, and then Department of Commerce, it could be seen that that was done quickly, and they had the ability through Commerce to comment because those materials are distributed to agencies and they're on that list. So for this conversation about critical area ordinance amendments, it's within staff's discretion and ability to seek respectful advice, not having to go through and have the mayor and council sit as a government with their government.
No, you don't. Correct.
But out of respect and honor. And there's nothing inappropriate at the code amendment level. So if that's what we're referring to, there's nothing that prohibits us from making, just as you said, putting it out there, we're doing it. And I would say the only restriction is that we are subject to RCW and state legislation. So our final amendments will be in conformance with that. And they may not exactly match with the feedback we get, but I think I agree staff finds it important to early and often communicate.
So Mark, I would be happy to, advise, show some sample letters that I have people use on just the format. This is a staff level. I'm not talking about needing to go to tribal council or our mayor needing to send it. I think it could be you, but there's still a protocol and a nice way to connect with the tribe at the right level. If you'd like my assistance, I offer it.
Yeah, I think I'm a department head, I'm a director, I wear 17 hats. I see no issue with that. I come from Snoqualmie where it was a very different matter.
Oh, I know.
So in the time that I've been here, I think what you're expressing and with the commission's support, we can do exactly that comfortably.
So Yanni, are you comfortable with us placing that on the agenda for next meeting?
That's fine, but I also don't want to discourage Mark from reaching out to me if he'd like to see some kind of sample letters for how I recommend people do that for processes just like this. So a code amendment, code amendment process. I'd be happy to talk about it more. If the commission is interested in ever having me present more broadly on kind of how we perhaps ought to engage with tribes as local governments and so forth. That's my job now. So if that's something that is of interest just for learning or anything else, I'm happy to do that. I do not insist on it in any way, but I do think it's important to at least have the knowledge and context for why most governments, are taking that more and more seriously as time goes on.
So then we'll leave it between the two of you for the time being, and then we can come back to this as an issue.
Sounds good.
And come back to it. I think it's a very helpful gesture. It's the planning commission doing this effort, right? So me with a template from Yanni sending this off has that effect. I think it's more warming for the planning commission who will consider those comments to at least look at that letter and maybe consider signing on, or at least acknowledging Mark. Go ahead and send it.
I support that.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay.
Thank you for the extra time.
It also corrects so I don't have to do it twice.
Okay. So then let's finish up the meeting then. Some reports and announcements.
Staff doesn't have any.
Okay. Additional public comments. I'm not sure if Maddie's still there or
she's gone. We have one other person, but we don't accept electron or online.
Right. Okay. Okay. So we'll talk about the agenda. We've already talked about it. So do we have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Second.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you for doing it. Thanks. Thank you, Yanni, for sharing your screen.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's one technical issue I am not resolved.
I won't be here next month.
Oh, you won't? Oh,
I had
that-
surgery,
that's the
so-
question. Okay. Okay. So John, if you just. Okay, well, thank you for letting me know. Will you all be here next? Okay, yes, I'm good.
Yes.
Okay.
Are August meetings a thing? Probably no reason there wouldn't be, but.
We said it's cancel July or August, depending on